Welcome to this module in which we'll provide an overview of dissemination strategies. So at the conclusion of the module, you should be able to explain the barriers and enablers to knowledge translation, as well as develop strategies to facilitate the dissemination of information. So what is translational research or translational activities? So basically it's the process that facilitates the transfer of high quality evidence, which in the end will affect change, whether it be from a policy perspective, a practice, or a research perspective. There are a variety of ways in which interventions or innovations can be translated, I guess, from an evaluation point of view or a research point of view to an individual or to the population. And what we'll do over the next few slides is hopefully provide a few examples of good knowledge transfer and dissemination strategies. So as you can see, translational research or the translational continuum is fairly intricate. It really goes from what we call the bench, so basic science, all the way up to, well, I guess the bedside and what we call beyond now. So discoveries from the bench that relate to translation to humans in terms of clinical trials or clinical research or programs that we can then upscale to the community and take more of a public health or population level approach to the outcomes. So really what we're focusing on in terms of dissemination strategies and that translational research or translational activity is at this T4 level. So translating things from individuals to a community approach, specifically for prevention and health promotion purposes. So an example of, I guess, a very, very successful public health and health promotion campaign is around folate supplementation. So we had evidence from the early 80s, here in Australia actually, by Australian researchers that folic acid, or taking supplements of folic acid around the time of conception, was associated with a protective effect against neural tube defects, so NTDs, spina bifida, etc. So that was in the 1980s. The late 80s we had other international studies replicate it, with some confirming up to 70% protection. So by 1992, health promotion campaigns in Western Australia specifically saw an increase of 30% of women taking folic acid in one form or another. And associated with that was a decrease of NTDs in Western Australia. Now, while that was a small win, I guess trying to broaden it from a public health or a population perspective can be difficult. So how to promote the benefits of folic acid, particularly in this group of our community? Well, one thing that you can see, and I think most people would know, is this notion of folate supplementation or fortification of foods, in this case with folic acid. So if you look at your breads, well, maybe you can't see the ingredients of your breads, but definitely for cereals, something like Wheat Bix, you can identify, scroll all the way down, folate with 100 micrograms per serve of Wheat Bix. Recommended dose of folic acid is 400 micrograms, which I think turns out to be about 4 Wheat Bix. So how did we get to the state where our Wheat Bix, our cereals, our breads, etc., have folate in it? How do we have fortification of our food? So a lot of it obviously involved the work of working with the government to make it policy as well as community involvement to highlight the benefits of fortifying these types of common foods, in this case with folic acid as well as other ingredients, because I guess the benefit far outweighed any limitations or adverse events that could be associated with fortifying food with folic acid. So again, a lot of it evolved around education, so educating the public about the evidence in terms of the benefits of folic acid, educating our politicians and government in order to make it a policy, so that it's mandated from that perspective of fortification of food. So as you'd mention, as you'd imagine, that type of process would come up against a variety of barriers in terms of implementing evidence into practice. So the first aspect, obviously, is changing behaviour. And so there's a whole field dedicated to behaviour change around behavioural sciences and how that may be achieved. Again, it's beyond the scope of this particular unit to go into much detail, but I guess just acknowledging that changing behaviour is probably the most difficult thing to do. So it's obviously going to be a large barrier when people are set in their ways and have been doing so for a number of years to change a particular behaviour. Whether it's a health behaviour, whether it's an attitude, it is fairly difficult to change. Much easier to change knowledge or perceived lack thereof on a particular topic. Barriers to implementation, public policy as well. So trying to change policy, as you can imagine, can be quite tricky. Dealing with government, dealing with the various levels of administration that would be required in order to change policy on a particular health issue. We've also got to think of the financial aspects. So trying to implement a particular intervention or evidence into action quite often will require a lot of consideration from a financial point of view. Low cost interventions and implementations are obviously going to be much more favourably viewed compared to interventions or dissemination strategies that require a lot of investment from a financial viewpoint. We've previously mentioned organisational barriers as well. So I guess keeping in mind that organisations, so whether it be government organisations, NGOs, industry, private organisations, all have their hierarchy and organisational structures. So again, trying to work through those sort of structures, as well as I guess the social structure that we have in our class society, can be quite challenging in terms of implementing science into action. And one of the biggest issues I guess we have with barriers to implementation is this notion of communication and health literacy. I think quite wrongly it's assumed that people or the general population has a high level of I guess health literacy and literacy, which is not always the case. You might be very well educated and highly literate, but when it comes to health information, reading technical jargon and actually understanding what it means are two different things. Then of course you have to consider other cultural issues, people from a non-English speaking background, and how they can interpret health information. Also goes to adding barriers to the communication aspect of implementation. Finally, the systems, and so how our systems operate. So whether it be our healthcare systems, looking at it from a private, public perspective, whether it be our social care systems, government systems, how they all integrate or don't integrate is also a consideration with each other. So does our public system integrate well with our social care system? Who knows? Well, I think I'll leave it at that. So any dissemination strategy that we have must have what we call SMART objectives. So the objectives designed, I guess, to reach the goals need to have these considerations at heart. So they need to be specific in terms of who we want and how we want to target and what we want to target. Must have some sort of measurable component to it. So if we're implementing our dissemination strategy, how do we measure whether or not it's been successful? Or how can we? Thinking about the achievements, are we actually being realistic? Are we saying that we're going to disseminate our awareness campaign about skin cancer and being sun smart to 25 million Australians? Well, is that really achievable? Are we being realistic? Relevancy. Relevancy to the health issue, the population group, and to the organisation. So is the dissemination strategy that you're designing, will it be relevant to that core group that you want it to be? We want to try and make it as specific as possible. And I guess the final thing is having a consideration in terms of timeframes. So during, what is the time frame that you want to use to evaluate how effective or otherwise your dissemination strategy has been? Are we looking at short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, or longer-term outcomes? And being able to define what they are will differ for different health issues and projects. So one of the greatest challenges that we face in I guess, public health and evaluation is this notion of barriers to implementation and what we call here the evidence pipeline. So it's a bit of a complicated diagram, but we'll try and simplify it as much as possible. So the triangle here really just represents the evidence that we have. So whether it be qualitative, quantitative data, whether it be formal clinical practice guidelines, systematic reviews, other evaluation that we've identified. So it's a body of knowledge that we know works, or we want to implement into practice. The challenges that we face are really all those issues that we talked about previously in terms of organisational, communication, behavioural, financial barriers. So if we think of something like the vaccination issue that we have here currently in Australia, that children need to be vaccinated, otherwise if they're not, they're refused entry to childcare centres. So firstly, if we're thinking about the evidence, we're dealing with trying to make sure that people are aware about the benefits of vaccination. From that, we can try and make sure that people are aware, but the next step is trying to ensure whether people accept that as fact, whether they accept it as truth. From that, this barrier of being, well, is it applicable to my family? So is vaccination applicable to my family? Another barrier may be, well, ability. So am I able to get my children vaccinated? So this is where sort of the issues around financial barriers come into play. I guess in the case of vaccination, it being free, it shouldn't, but another vaccination, it may be a barrier. Another barrier may be that, if people are aware and accept and believe that it's applicable to them and are able to act upon it, whether or not they actually do act upon it. That is, yes, I will go and get my child vaccinated. And then the last couple of, relate to really that behavioural aspect of agreeing and adhering to it. So as you can see, a lot of barriers in terms of go to woe. So having the information to ensuring that it's implemented in practice, and all of those barriers around behavioural, organisational, communication, health literacy, financial aspects can impact upon the success to which your outcome of interest is actually implemented in practice. So this is a bit of a complicated figure, but just again to highlight that there is a body of work out there that has been dedicated to identifying how best to implement evidence into practice, and very much draws upon, I guess, the qualitative aspects that we've been talking about in trying to identify the barriers and enablers. So why isn't research being implemented into practice? Why can't we implement this evidence into changing policy? Or how can we overcome these barriers in order to change policy or practice or whatnot? So very much, again, this knowledge creation, that we've got this knowledge, we've got this sort of product that we want to sell to the public, I guess, and working through this formal technique, which is known as knowledge to action framework. So again, very much identifying, okay, well, what is the problem? So very much similar to a needs analysis. So what are some of the issues that we have, whether it be at a local or a national situation? And from that, we can adapt the knowledge that we have. Critical thing with this knowledge action framework in terms of dissemination is being able to identify, well, what are the barriers? What are the enablers to implementing the evidence or information into practice? So this is where our qualitative research really comes to the fore. So by conducting interviews and focus group discussions with key stakeholders, we can begin to identify what are the issues that may prevent us or may promote the implementation of evidence into practice. So hitting upon these things around behaviours, organisational health literacy, other cultural issues, we can begin to start to identify what are the barriers, what are the enablers, and how can we facilitate our product or tailor it to suit the population that we're targeting. From that, we can monitor its usage and hopefully evaluate the outcome. So by doing that type of process, hopefully we can identify different types of strategies that we can use in order to disseminate our project or our process to our stakeholders. Now, traditionally, we've used strategies such as conferences at a local level, seminars or local sort of gatherings, open events. More traditionally, from an academic point of view, we've used journals. Most of them have been fee-paying journals, so whilst it's great to see the abstract, unless you're linked to a university or hospital, you usually have to pay some sort of fee. More recently, we're seeing more and more open access journals popping up. So again, providing the ability for anyone to jump on to the journal website and access the information. In one of the earlier modules, we talked about academic detailing, which is a really fancy way of saying we're providing one-on-one communication sessions with key stakeholders to get the message or point across to the particular group. More and more with technology evolving, we're seeing greater use of social media. So we've obviously had the internet for a long time, and the proliferation of websites is great, provides free access to information, but much like the Wild West of old. The internet can be the Wild West where anyone can jump on at any time and create a website without much I guess consideration of the facts or regulation around what is being put up. What we're seeing more and more from a public health point of view is professional bodies, governments, organisations using selective aspects of technology to disseminate information. So rather than just from the use of websites, through the use of social media, Twitter and Facebook in particular, we're seeing this sort of push versus pull effect. So where information is being pushed out via Twitter or via Facebook, and it reaches a fairly large audience, and so from that the audience can pull more information from websites or other sort of larger repositories. So hopefully that's provided a bit of an overview of the challenges that we face in disseminating research, in disseminating interventions, and conducting evaluations in the public health domain.